I want to talk about another nuance in price action analysis, which is the size of the spike or the size of the run and what kind of patterns to maybe expect from them. There's this truism in small cap gappers where the bigger the gap, the higher the chances are that it'll fade. And you can say that the reason for that is that the bigger the gap, the more incentive there are for sellers to sell, the more likely it'll have pressure throughout the day. And of course, that's a huge generalization. And there is the black swan, which does start at a 10 and then picks it up from there, right? But generally speaking, the bigger the gap, the more likely it is to fade. And I think that the spirit of that truism exists in other parts of the small cap price action universe. For example, it's not just true that the bigger the gapper in pre-market is, the more likely it is to fade. The same is true for midday runners, and the same is true for after-hour runners. So those are just generalizations, of course. But what I want to talk about today is something far more specific. I want to zoom in for a moment to the initial ignition of a runner, and typically the way they start is with some kind of bull flag. On AIFF, you can see the initial pull flag over here, and then you see consolidation around the middle, which creates the flag part. And then the pattern starts developing throughout the day and creates a trend. However, on LNAI, we have the initial flagpole and then the flag and then just splat. And if you compare percentages that both flag poles ran, LNAI came from 39 cents to $1.05, which is 170%, whereas AIFF went from $1.60 to $2.40, so around 50%. So similarly to how generally the bigger the run, the more likely it is to fade, you can look at that initial flag post to give you clues as to how close you might be to the exhaustion. Now, you always have to remember that all of these nuances are part of a lot of variables that you look at, like news, fundamentals, the environment, the whatever. But generally speaking, the bigger the gap, the more likely it is to find sellers. And the bigger the initial flagpole, the less likely it is to have many more legs after it. Now, I'm not saying that every major flagpole that's really big will only be a one leg and done move. But what I am saying is that the bigger the initial move, the less likely it is to move much further than there, and vice versa.